Thanks. Airlines, even the London Stock Exchange, are suffering technical glitches this morning as Microsoft reports an outage across its online services. In the United States, United Airlines, Delta, American, all grounding flights globally. We are seeing a huge disruption in the airline sector around the world. Plus, Donald Trump outlines his America First policy as he accepts the Republican nomination, detailing the assassination attempt upon him. Pressure is mounting on Joe Biden to bow out. We're going to talk about that. Let's talk about what is happening with these markets and figure out exactly the ripple effect from the Microsoft story into what is going on. And as you can see, you got red across the screen. Some of this is related to where we were with the United States yesterday. Some of this is related to what we're seeing in terms of the outages today. It's 9 o'clock here in London. What that means basically is that you are going to now start seeing pre-market trading over in the United States. I'm just trying to get us a handle on what is happening here. Crowdstrike is already down by 14%. We understand that this could be a software upgrade coming out of Crowdstrike impacting the Microsoft 365 platform. Microsoft is down by 2.5% at this point. I want to take you into what is happening with the US airline story as well. As I say, there was a ground stop issued earlier on by the major US carriers. It's not just limited to the US carriers, but the US carriers have issued a ground stop this morning. I got United Airlines pre-market unchanged. We'll see what happens there. No, there's a better price, maybe a more realistic price. We're down by 1.2%. American Airlines looks a little soft, but Delta's down by 0.9%. We'll see what happens with American when we get an upgrade on that. European airlines are under pressure as well. We have seen impacts across Europe in terms of the impact that this 365 outage is having. Ryanair's down, Lufthansa's down, Wizz is down, IAG is down by 2.5%. The issue here is that once you start getting aircraft out of position, it has a very long-term effect. So we're going to figure out exactly what the effect is going to be over this weekend and what impact ultimately is going to have. But this, in some ways, we don't really understand the full parameters of what is going on here. So we're going to work our way through the next hour and try and figure out exactly how that happened. So let's get started with that process.
Newsmakers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
2 minutes past the hour, lots going on this morning. Welcome to The Pulse this Friday. I'm Guy Johnson. I'm in for Francine Lacqua. Let's kind of go around the world and go around the sector story and try and understand the impact that this Microsoft outage is having. Sam Unstead joins me around the table to give us the effect into the banking sector, into the broader industry story. But absolutely the centre of this outage story this morning, and the area where we feel like we're getting the biggest effect is within aviation. Bloomberg's Benedict Campbell joins me now from Berlin. He leads our aviation coverage. Benny, talk me through the impact here. Talk me through what we know. Talk me through the scale of the outages that we're seeing here. I've never seen anything like this before.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we've both covered this industry for long enough to have experienced outages. You know, there was one in the UK last year with NATS. There was one in the US at the start of last year. These things happen. But as you said, they don't happen on this kind of scale. That's unprecedented. And it's been really cascading around the world. It's now solidly taken root here in Europe. Airports like Berlin are down. KLM, the airline in the Netherlands, they've said that they are disrupted. Ryanair, really across the board, wherever you look. Interestingly, some of the airlines in the Middle East, some of the big ones like Emirates or Dubai Airport, so far say no issues. That might change. This is a fast-moving situation. To your point, well, where does it lead us? It will create sort of a cascading set of chaotic scenes in the next couple of days, because as you said earlier, a lot of these aircraft will have to stay on the ground or land in places they shouldn't have landed, i.e. airports they shouldn't have been, and that puts them out of position. So getting that system, that very finely tuned system, back together again, that's going to take many days. I was due to fly to London tomorrow for the Farnborough Air Show that happens next week that we'll both be covering. So that'll be interesting whether by then things are back to normal, but this is not a short-term blip. Yeah, we need you for that, Benny. I'm hoping that we can find another way of getting you here, because that's kind of important to me personally. Talk to me about what this, though, tells us about the strength of the systems in which these airlines operate. This is an industry that traditionally has been not particularly good at IT. It operates with long, kind of, and old legacy systems.
Does this tell us that kind of that vulnerability still exists? And how much effort has been made over the last few years to try and remove some of this vulnerability? How much better is the airline industry at IT? Because it doesn't feel like it is this morning.
Yeah, I mean, that's a topic that will invariably come up. It's probably too soon to say at this point, but this is a topic of continuous debate. When we had that NATS outage last year, there was really a lot of angry messaging directed from airlines at air traffic control. We know that some airlines have, as you said, fairly outdated IT. Some of them are upgrading it. BA, for instance, they're pumping billions into their systems. Sometimes you will notice the effect with a creaky app or something like this. This is obviously far more fundamental, but these things take time. There's taxpayers' money involved. In the US, the FAA is involved. This is a system that moves slowly and is also built around safety. So if something goes wrong, typically what happens is the system grinds to a halt just to keep everyone safe. So what you're seeing now with United, with American, with Delta, that these planes aren't taking off. Obviously, they'd be safe to fly, but this is a system that aims to be as safe as it can and takes these extra precautions. Annoying for us it might be, but in some ways, in a weird way, it shows that the system, that the way it's set up is working, that it's slowing down, that it's grounding to a halt.
Sam, let me bring you into the conversation. Where else are we seeing the effect?
Well, I think airlines is by far the most prominent, right? So there have been, when we were looking at Down Detector this morning, there were lots and lots of different companies on there. It doesn't look like there's too much of an effect elsewhere, but that will probably develop as the morning goes on. Just as I got up from my desk, and Benny will be extremely aware of this, but there was airline after airline after airline after airline saying that they're experiencing disruptions and IT issues. Yep. So that's the key area at the moment. One thing I want to pick up on, actually, and there's a really nice post on the live blog that we have covering this at the moment, about how important this is on the cybersecurity front. So, Guy, you mentioned Crowdstrike at the beginning. They're getting hit very hard in US pre-market trading. They have confirmed that there was an update to their system that they are now rolling back to try to end these
Reset
issues.
The system.
Yeah, effectively. But that has hit all of Microsoft's 365 systems, and that's where you're seeing this problem. With cybersecurity, those software systems have to go very deep into the stack. They have to be extremely deep and have access to almost everything. So when they go down, which is quite rare, it has a huge impact across the whole IT system. And in this case, it appears to have hit effectively all of Microsoft 365, and that is one of the major providers in the world.
This shows how interconnected we are. This is kind of the airline sector is emblematic of that this morning. You're seeing these issues around the world. During the pandemic, we had supply chain constraints. Is this just another example of concentrated supply chains, single-source suppliers? And that is something that ultimately businesses are going to have to resolve and go to multiple suppliers in order to maybe deal with this. Is that even possible?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question, because to do it on this kind of scale is very, very difficult. So you're right, that market is now really almost completely dominated by 3 or 4 large companies, the cloud market and cloud storage market. And so when you do get an issue, it does spread incredibly widely, incredibly quickly. And so, that exact question that was being asked, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic and then really through it as we started to open again, is that concentration of supply chain. And if that supply chain goes down, how much of an impact that has.
Sam Munstead and Bloomberg's Benedict Campbell joining us out of Berlin. Both, thank you very much indeed. I'm very much hoping that Benedict finds a way to get to London this weekend. Monday morning, the Farnborough Air Show. I suspect this is a subject that is going to be absolutely dominant at that show when we discuss what is going on in this industry. Some great coverage lined up, some great guests lined up. I hope they all make it to the show. Let's get more on what is happening here. Nataliia Lipikhina, head of EMEA Equity Strategy at JPMorgan Private Bank, joining me on set. Good morning.
Good morning.
So I was, as you sat down, thinking about kind of how we were going to start this conversation. The pandemic taught us many things. Taught us about supply chains. Taught us about inflation and how supply chains can affect inflation very, very quickly. Talked to us about concentration of risk and maybe how investors need to sort of have diversified portfolios to kind of manage some of that diversification risk or concentration risk. As you see this story developing, how does it fold into your thinking about how we should manage our money, how we should think about where we invest, how we see financial markets developing? Is there a relationship between these two?
Yeah, the news this morning are definitely impacting the sentiment in the markets, but it's very difficult to understand what the real impact is. And we're still digesting the news. In terms of the JPMorgan Private Bank Outlook, which we recently launched, the mid-year outlook, our title is A Global, Strong Economy in a Fragile World.
Yep.
And this is exactly what we're seeing right now. There is definitely a need for the investing into infrastructure, either digital or physical. And I think the news this morning is just highlighting that piece even stronger.
But it highlights as well the kind of the concentration risk that we have. We've spent a long time trying to understand supply chains. Now we need to maybe understand kind of how the connected nature of the IT setup also folds into that narrative. Do we need to think, is this something that is going to further fragment the way that business operates? The fact that maybe you need to see multiple source suppliers, maybe multiple IT systems, because all of that has the effect that we saw from supply chains in the pandemic, and that is inflation. The more we need to harden our systems, harden our supply chains, the more inflationary they become, the more costly they become to run. Is this part of that same narrative?
I think it's still very early to tell what exactly the impact will be, right? This is definitely a fragile world. We are the long-term investors.
Yep.
We need to see, how earnings are playing out through the long term. We've been talking about, the rolling earnings recession going into rolling earnings recovery. This is what we're seeing so far. US market is showing 9% of earnings growth. And if that happens, that will be the largest growth.
How much of that's coming from the technology sector?
A big part of that, but what you're seeing is the rest of the market is also catching up. And I think a great example of that has been a rotation that recently happened into the mid-caps in the US. And this is also one of the areas that we at Private Bank like right now. Because if you look into mid-caps, they actually have underperformed in the last 2 years.
Massively.
And they also had the earnings recession that hit much harder than the large caps.
Yep.
And I think what we're seeing today will probably emphasize that even more. We may have a bit of volatility in the market, and with the market expecting the potential upcoming Fed cuts, the market will look through into the other areas of the market that have underperformed.
If we see the other areas outperforming, does the index go up or down?
We still see upside, single to mid-sized upside on S&P by the mid-2025.
Because some big technology names have led this market. They have contributed for a massive amount, the upside in terms of the index points gains that we have seen in the S&P and the Nasdaq, obviously. If they start to fall by the wayside, if we don't see those companies delivering, and we'll come on to whether or not those companies do deliver, from a share price point of view, how do I play this? Do I buy the S&P equal weight versus the S&P? How do I make that trade work if the technology stocks are going to come off the boil and we are going to see the rest of the market performing better?
We still continue to like S&P,
right,
as I mentioned before. What the market is focusing right now is big tech is to report in the next 2 weeks.
Yep.
The market is waiting to see the confirmation that those companies are delivering. We need to hear about AI.
Yep.
And we need to hear about the capital investment that those companies have been talking about for the last quarter. This is what the market is now waiting to see, the confirmation that those earnings are coming through. And if they're coming through, we don't think that there will be a big pullback in the market.
What about Europe? And let me just kind of think about the political angle of all of this as well. We're seeing political chaos on both sides of the Atlantic. The European economy feels like it's got a little bit of traction at the moment, but not that much. Where do I want to invest geographically right now? And how does the political story impact what you're thinking about on that front?
So Europe has underperformed slightly since the beginning of June compared to S&P.
Yep.
When we look into the earnings season, the market is expecting 4% earnings growth, which is, by the way, the largest in the last 2 years. We're still very early in the earnings cycle right now. But what we're seeing is the price is a bit underwhelming. Some companies are underperforming. To us, that means that there are loads of alpha opportunities in the market, in different sectors.
Yep. But you've got a stock pick.
Industrials, that are focused on the data centers, or the luxury names, or the technology names, or companies in the healthcare. We call them European national champions. So the companies that are based out of Europe, that have international presence, some of them have underperformed, we think this is where the market should focus on.
Nataliia, nice to see you. Thanks for stopping by to see us. Nataliia Lipikhina, head of EMEA Equity Strategy at JPMorgan Private Bank. Thank you very much indeed. Coming up, we're going to talk more about Donald Trump. The first address since his assassination last night. What have we learned from that address and where are we going? Who's he going to be facing in the November election? Joe Biden facing mounting pressure to exit the presidential race. We'll talk about all of that next. This is Bloomberg. When I woke up this morning, the story I thought I'd spend most of my day talking about was the RNC convention last night. Donald Trump addressing the Republican National Convention, recounting harrowing details of the assassination attempt on his life a few days ago.
If I had not moved my head at that very last instant, the assassin's bullet would have perfectly hit its mark, and I would not be here tonight. We would not be together.
Donald Trump accepting the nomination. Who's he going to be facing in November? At the moment, we think it's Joe Biden, but that story feels like it's developing at a pace at the moment. So we need to discuss all of this. Stephanie Baker joining me around the table to do just that. Let's start with Donald Trump. This has been a slick RNC. It has felt like a united RNC. How different was that to what we would have expected even 6 months ago?
I think it's hugely different. Let's face it, Donald Trump has staged one of the most remarkable political comebacks, in my memory at least. He started off his speech last night sounding like a different Donald Trump, touching on these points of unity, recounting his harrowing assassination attempt, but then he veered off script into these rambling attacks. He called former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi Crazy Nancy. He talked about an immigrant invasion. He talked about the economy in decline, which is patently false. So if he could have stuck to the script of that unity, I think he would have been unstoppable. I think the unity you did see at the Republican convention is in stark contrast to what we're seeing in the Democratic Party, which is just riven by divisions. So, we can't imagine a Democratic National Convention as unified or energized as this.
Yeah, and you wonder whether the unity we saw in Milwaukee is now going to have a big effect in terms of how the Democrats kind of play what they do, see what they do next in terms of Joe Biden. We now know it's Donald Trump and Vance. And who's on the other side?
Well, it's moving quickly, and I think the fact that the Republicans showed such a united front may have sped up the process. There's talk that he could perhaps announce, that he's backing Kamala Harris even this weekend, possibly early next week.
Does the COVID diagnosis affect that, do you think?
I think it does. He's isolating at home. He's not able to come out and give a big speech. He's still saying that he's not dropping out because as soon as he gives any hint that he's doing that, he's done. But the fact that these big political figures are no longer denying that they have come to him and said, we don't think you have a path to victory, I think that is significant.
Is the Obama intervention, that's what's been kind of reported over the last 24 hours. How significant? Because that's the one I've been waiting for. He's never really come out and backed Joe Biden in the way that you would have anticipated a few years ago. But the fact that he's now sounding cautious. Obama's a huge figure within this party.
He is. Remember, however, it was sometimes a tense relationship between Obama and Biden when he was vice president. So that's not exactly the figure I think would influence him, Biden's thinking. I think Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are far more influential. And, the reports that I have read, Pelosi, reading out alternative polls showing he does not have a path to victory, that some of the swing states he's falling behind in a way that looks like he can't pull ahead. I think that is far more significant.
Stephanie. we're going to have an interesting weekend on this one, and then potentially early into next week. Stephanie Baker joining us on the latest on US politics. We'll continue that conversation in around 50 minutes' time. Kim Darroch, the former British ambassador to the US during the Donald Trump first presidency, will be joining us. We'll get his take on what is happening here. We also need to keep you up to speed with what is happening with this global IT outage, grounding flights around the world. It's taking some TV stations offline. We are still online. You can continue to get an update on what is happening here. This is Bloomberg. The IT outage is having an effect on global markets. Let's take a look at where we stand currently with US futures. We're a way away, obviously, from the start of US trading, but as you can see, it's a negative story. Remember, we sold off into the close yesterday as well. Let's run through some individual names. Microsoft, Crowdstrike, this is the epicenter of the action this morning. Let's take a look at how they're trading pre-market this morning. They are soft, and as you can see, Crowdstrike very much under pressure this morning. Before I let you go, quick look at some of the airlines as well, maybe to give you an idea of what is happening on that front as well. It's having an effect. We'll continue to monitor it. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. Welcome back. You're watching The Pulse. I'm Guy Johnson in London, in for Francine Lacqua. Let me get you up to speed with what you need to know this morning. Banks, airlines, even the London Stock Exchange suffering technical glitches. Microsoft says some services are starting to improve after an outage across its online services. United Airlines, Delta, airlines globally around the world being affected by this story. This is a Asia story, a Europe story, a US story. Politics is never far from obviously what we're talking about as well. Donald Trump outlining his America First policy as he accepts the Republican nomination, detailing the assassination attempt upon his life, pressure mounting on Joe Biden to drop out of the race. OK, let's talk about the market effect of all of this, the impact of all of this, and figure out exactly where we go next. We have seen a global outage. Microsoft is at the center of it. It looks like it's some sort of a Crowdstrike security update that may have gone wrong, but it's having a massive effect around the world. We started to see evidence of it first thing this morning with Asian airlines and check-in problems. It's now spread to Europe, to the United States. We have a ground stop on many of the major US carriers that are going to be affecting the start of the day in the United States. Krithi Gupta and I have been kind of monitoring this story as it's begun to develop throughout the morning. So Microsoft beginning to say that things are improving?
They are, and they've been saying that from the get-go. Remember, this initially started overnight in Japan as well, when that was the first reports that were put out. And they said the issues in that region were resolved altogether. Then it kind of got bigger when we're talking about the 365 apps, and then they are still waiting to fully resolve the issue from there. But they are saying that some of their services, I believe, quote, continuing to see improvements. Look, we don't know how much of this is specifically related to the outages we're seeing in the airlines, the stock exchange, the delays in banks as well, or even the fact of what Crowdstrike is seeing, what's happening as well. Are they connected issues, or are they just really poor timing? We still don't know those details.
We don't know those details, but what it flags once again is the interconnectedness of these systems, which are only going to get more pronounced, you could argue, and the concentration. There's only a few cloud providers around the world, and you see the impact of one of them potentially having an issue.
We do. And to your point, the kind of big scare factors, if you see the likes of Asia, this is regarding Asia specifically, the Microsoft offering, see AWS go down as well, then suddenly the entire world is affected. If you look at it from a regional perspective, you're only seeing about 3 out of the 5 domestic airlines in the States right now call for the FAA stop. But you're seeing a much bigger kind of impulse in Europe, in Asia. Yet, of course, we're still waiting for the rest of the United States to wake up. So we'll see what the broader spread of it looks like. But if we're looking at a roadmap from the last time this happened in the aviation space, it was with Southwest Airlines. It brought up these kind of tech issues. It brought up this infrastructure issue. And it took about a week to resolve the entire system, not just Southwest.
Yeah, it's 4:30 a.m. in New York right now. I guess we'll learn over the next kind of few hours the impact that this potentially could have as some of those systems come online. It does. You and I were discussing this earlier on. In some ways, there are parallels with the pandemic.
Yeah.
and the concentration of risk, the supply chains, the single-source suppliers. And I wonder whether that's once again going to be the takeaway from this.
It could be. And I think what's a little bit scarier here is, look, this is coming into a time when so many companies are feeling the pressure, especially to accelerate not only into AI, but specifically into cloud as well. Remember, this is a 10-year-long process. A lot of companies around the world still haven't fully integrated into cloud as well. And this is kind of a fear factor to show that. But in the process of doing that, they've also been amping up their cybersecurity piece, because since the pandemic, we've also had 2 wars in this region alone. And this is something that people are really trying to talk about from an infrastructure point of view, but a security point of view as well. And I'll caution that statement by saying that, first off, Crowdstrike is a cybersecurity company. And second, in this particular instance, it doesn't look like there's any early signs of some sort of cyber attack or kind of terror threat or anything like that. But it is going to bring up those questions. Yes, exactly.
In terms of what we know, is there any historical precedence? I've been trying to figure this out this morning in terms of, you talked about how long the airlines have taken to get back online. We have seen outages with updates in the past for big for big IT systems. The scale of this thing the system feels like it could take a while, though, to resolve. They're saying it's improving, but do we get a sense of kind of, do they have a timeline at this point? Have you seen anything?
We haven't seen a timeline yet, but I think to your point, talked a lot about the airlines, but this is where financial services really comes in handy, because when this news first broke, yes, the airlines took the brunt of the hit, but you had the likes of HSBC, Barclays, Standard Chartered taking some of the biggest hits as well. When we saw the market open this morning, it took a few extra minutes for those trades to come in. The index level didn't open until far later than some of these individual stocks. So we're still waiting to see what the financial repercussions are as well. I believe we have some our print colleagues doing some reporting as well on what those implications are, where the delays are coming from, and whether this does actually affect those trading updates, because that's what you're going to see come in full force over in the States when more of those traders hit their desks.
It's fascinating, isn't it? But you put airplanes out of position means people out of position.
Yeah.
So there's going to be loads of people who normally would be attending meetings, going to various events, doing all kinds of things that they need to do around. None of those people are going to be traveling, and it's going to be really interesting to see whether or not there is a read across from this into the data that we start to see over the next few months and into the economic numbers that we're going to be watching quite so carefully. I don't know yet. It's going to be one of those extra kind of left field factors that we need to fold into our thinking.
Yeah, and I think you made a key point there is when you talk a lot about business travel, people usually come back on Fridays, and so this is when you see these outages, those delays are going to show up throughout the weekend as well. I'm curious to see, we talked about the banks, we talked about the airlines as well. I'm curious to see what retailers are affected as well.
Yep, that's true.
McDonald's was, I think, one that had come up in conversation, some of their international chains as well. But if you're talking about those IT infrastructures, this is why the U.S. needs to wake up and see what the damage is being done here, because this does, of course, have a massive effect. But the retailers will be interesting because, of course, the consumer base is much larger in the States than it is here.
Yep, you walk into a McDonald's these days. Yeah, the two are probably connected. Like it's all on a big screen, and that's how you order.
No Egg McMuffins for you.
I'm hungry now. Kriti, thank you very much indeed. Kriti Gupta on the latest. We'll come back to this story and keep you up to speed as it develops. As I say, 4:30 in the morning over in the United States. We'll see what effect it has. Let's get back to the UK economy now. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, warning of, quote, difficult decisions ahead as she tries to fix Britain's public finances. The country's first female Chancellor joining Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua for an exclusive interview. This, of course, after the Labour Party's landslide election win earlier this month. Francine kicked off by asking her about support from big investors.
That is absolutely crucial, because there's no plans that I can draw up in my new office in the Treasury that are going to work unless we have business buy-in. And I hope that businesses saw in Labour's manifesto and also in the plans that we've announced in government have the fingerprints of business all over them, because these plans have been co-written with business because they're all about unlocking private sector investment into our economy.
Chancellor, are you considering tax breaks to either boost pension savings or make UK investments more attractive?
I'm not going to announce any tax breaks or tax changes without saying where the money is going to come from. And we will have a budget later this year. But I also just need to be really clear and honest about the scale of the challenge that we've inherited with the public finances. We're going to have to make difficult decisions. We need to fix the foundations before we can start rebuilding things in Britain. But unlike the previous government, I am going to be honest about the scale of the challenge. I'm going to level with people, and together we're going to rebuild our country based on that private sector business investment to get our economy growing. Because I asked the Treasury officials to give me an assessment of how much stronger the UK economy would be today if we'd have grown at just the average rate of OECD economies these last 14 years. And the answer is we'd be £140 billion bigger today.
The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, speaking exclusively with Francine yesterday. We're going to stay with politics. Coming up, Donald Trump basking in total control of the GOP as Joe Biden's candidacy continues to face serious questions. We're going to be speaking to Kim Darroch, the former British ambassador to the United States. He served during Donald Trump's first presidency. We'll have that conversation next. This is Bloomberg. 4:40 a.m. in New York. It'll be waking up soon. Does it ever sleep? But I suspect that this morning will be a rude awakening. The reason for that, what we are seeing with this global IT outage, yet fully, I suspect, to be baked into the United States. At the moment, futures are quite negative. I wonder whether they get more negative. There are some key stocks that are under significant pressure this morning. Microsoft is down. It is causing, you could argue, the problems this morning, but at the epicenter of the story is actually potentially Crowdstrike, the cybersecurity company. It looks as if this may have been caused by a Crowdstrike update. We don't have the details. I'm not pointing any fingers at this point in time, but we are watching very carefully to see how quickly the situation can be resolved. US Airlines, a number of them have issued ground stops this morning. We'll talk to Sidharth Philip in just a moment from our aviation team to get an update on what is happening here. But we are seeing some of the US airlines under pressure as a result of this. Remember what we saw with Southwest. It took about a week to fix this. This could have a significant impact on US travel over the next few days. Let's turn back to what is happening in the United States, but from a different perspective. The US political situation and how it is developing. President Joe Biden's grasp on the Democratic presidential nomination appears to be slipping from his grasp. This as he weighs increasingly public warnings from his party's top lawmakers. Perhaps the harshest blow, a Washington Post report that former President Barack Obama has told allies that Biden's path to victory has been greatly diminished. He isn't the only one. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer are in the mix as well. How does this develop? How does this compare and contrast as well with what we've seen out of the RNC over the last few days, which has been a story of unity? Joining us now to discuss all of this, the former UK ambassador to the United States, Kim Darroch. Kim, nice to see you this morning. Thanks for the time. Let's start off, actually. I want to get to Joe Biden in just a moment. But first of all, your thoughts on what we saw at the RNC and what the message is from the rest of the world from that gathering.
What it mostly reminded me was just how different American politics is from British, European politics. I mean, all the hoopla, the theatre of the whole thing, the run-up to the Trump speech, then this marathon 93-minute speech from him, of which the first 20 minutes, the stuff about the assassination attempt, I think will have riveted the TV audience. The rest of it was rather like his campaign speeches, his stump speeches, and quite rambling, and some of the most extraordinary claims in it that would have been ridiculed in the UK, but which in that kind of forum, with that kind of audience, you can get away with. So it's a very different event. And it was, as you say, a very, very united conference and a coronation for the second Trump attempt at the presidency.
If I'm sitting here in Europe and I'm trying to understand the implications, are the implications that we are going to see a more isolationist America? Are we going to see a more Asia-focused America? Is Europe going to have to spend more on its defence?
Well, if you add into what Trump's positions are, the appointment of J.D. Vance as his vice president, and Vance's even harder line on stopping aid to Ukraine, he's even more, as it were, isolationist and unilateralist, then that's the way it looks. Trump is nothing if not unpredictable, so we would have to wait and see how it unfolded. And European leaders would have to make the best shot they can at arguments from dissuading him from some of his ideas, like leaving the Paris climate change deal, like stopping military aid to Ukraine, and his disdain for NATO. But certainly there are worrying aspects of his policy pronouncements, foreign policy pronouncements, that would suggest a difficult time for Europe, and Europe having to do, as you say, a lot more itself.
Is Europe prepared? Is Europe prepared for Trump 2.0? And is Europe more vulnerable to a Trump presidency than it was, a second Trump presidency, than it was when it comes to the first one?
In terms of preparation, Trump's been ahead in the opinion polls, only a couple of points or so, but basically ahead all year. So Europeans, the government, people in government in Europe will have been talking for months now about the implications of a Trump presidency. And that gap has widened since that disastrous debate performance by Biden. It's now 5 points, I think, in some polls. So people will be thinking about that. Are we prepared? I mean, and is the situation more dangerous? Yes, it is. It is because you now have war in Europe with the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You have conflict in the Middle East, and you have rising tension with China. So at a moment when US global leadership, you could even say, is more called for than ever, we have the potential risk of a rather unilateralist and isolationist America. So yes, these are dangerous times.
Do the Democrats have a candidate that can beat Trump, do you think?
Well, this is obviously very speculative. I feel myself that Biden can't beat Trump on the basis of his performance in recent weeks, and that the risk for the Democrats is something approaching a landslide. A state like Virginia, which should be solid Democrat territory, is currently showing a 2-point lead for Trump. So it wouldn't just be Democrats losing the battleground states, but more as well. I think they have 3 or 4 candidates who can do better against Trump than Biden could. I think Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, is a very effective politician. Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan is a very strongly performing governor there. You have Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, another swing state, where he is doing well as a Democrat governor. And then you have, obviously, Kamala Harris. So I think there are 3 or 4 names there, all of whom some polls suggest do better against Trump than Biden.
Is the outcome different from a European point of view, depending on who wins? How big's the spread between how Europe deals with the next American cycle if there is a Democrat in the White House versus a Republican in the White House? Even Joe Biden has taken a very, very strong line on issues like China and has felt that the Europeans have not supported him in that effort. How different to the United States are we going to see regardless of who wins?
You're absolutely right. 2 points where whoever wins, there isn't going to be much difference. One is China, where there is a consensus across the national security community in America that China is the existential challenge for this century, and where whoever is in the White House, there will be pressure on Europe to do more, to challenge China, to stand up to China, maybe to introduce trade measures or sanctions or this kind of thing, depending on China's behavior. The second is just international trade, global trade. Biden is no free trader. Trump isn't. Biden's kept on most of the tariffs from the Trump first presidency, and Trump would increase them. So equally on trade, there are going to be difficult times. But then there'll be differences over NATO and over Ukraine. So there'll be some divergences and some similarities.
Kim, thanks very much indeed, sir. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Kim Darroch, former UK ambassador to the United States. Greatly appreciate your insight. I want to come to another story that is worth noting this morning. The Interfax News Service is reporting that Russian prosecutors are seeking an 18-year sentence for the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. Gershkovich and the newspaper have denied Russia's accusations that he was spying for the CIA. It is the first time since the Cold War that Russia has tried a US reporter for this crime. The trial is taking place behind closed doors, and a verdict is expected later today. Now, coming up, we'll come back to what is happening with the Microsoft outage. The aviation industry is being hit hard. The vacation season is getting fully underway. We are seeing an impact across Europe and the United States. We'll have the latest next. Siddharth Philip is going to join us from our aviation team. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Let's get back to our top story, the technical issues that we're seeing around the world. Transport being affected. We talked mainly this morning about what is happening with the airline sector, but the port of Rotterdam this morning, I think it's Europe's busiest port. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty certain it is. Some firms in port are being impacted by the outage. Heathrow Airport this morning, flights are operational, but contingency plans are in place. It's affecting other areas of the aviation sector more severely. Let's get an update on what we know, what we don't know. Siddharth Philip joins us now from our aviation team. What do we know, Sid?
So at the moment, it's affecting airlines differently, but it's affecting airlines across the world. And so we're seeing airlines from United Airlines, Delta Airlines, to carriers like Lufthansa, Ryanair, and even Indian low-costers like Indigo and SpiceJet. So across the board, across the world, we've seen a massive impact from this outage. In the US, it's been particularly hard because airlines like Delta, United, American Airlines, they've all put in ground stop notices that basically mean all operations are suspended until they can get a handle on things. Whereas in some cases in Europe, flights are still operational, but either airports are affected or booking systems and check-in systems are affected. And so airlines are having to manually check in passengers, sort of going back to the pen and pencil sort of method of checking in carriers. And that's sort of affecting carriers in terms of flight delays, cancellations and others.
I see American's just cancelled its ground stop. So maybe things are starting to become a little bit more clear. That's the latest out of American Airlines. As you can see, its stock pre-market is up by 0.4%, but we do see other ground stops. The problem is, as soon as you stop flights taking off, landing, people checking in, everything gets out of position.
Absolutely.
And we've learned this in the past, that takes, and you saw it with Southwest, it takes a huge amount of time to resolve that.
Exactly. I mean, the ground stop is the easy bit because you sort of stop aircraft. But the difficult bit is actually getting operations back on track and getting things back in position. I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, that for airlines, every operation is sort of time-bound. So if an aircraft is in a certain place at a certain time, it needs to leave a certain place at a certain time in order for it to make the next destination. And so for the airline industry, getting sort of resilience and there is very little buffer in the system, and they need to be able to get the aircraft in the right place. They need the crews in the right place, and then they need to get the backlog cleared. And that's what takes a long time for the airline industry to sort of get things back on track.
Have you ever seen anything? This is global. I've seen this regionally, but I've never seen this globally.
Yeah, we saw that the NATS outage in the UK that affected UK carriers. We saw the FAA issues that affected the NOTAM issues that affected US carriers. But this is a global issue, and I mean, there's nothing been like that for a while, and especially as airlines sort of get more interconnected and they sort of use more sort of cloud systems and they use more sort of much more complicated systems. I mean, it gets more and more complicated for them to get things back on track, and it's going to be interesting.
Well, we've got the Farnborough Air Show on Monday. It'll give us certainly something to talk about. I'm looking forward to that coverage. OK, that wraps things up. The Bloomberg Brief is up next. Danny Bergerman, his cranny. They've got something to talk about this morning. This is Bloomberg.